Welcome to Resilience Radio, building wellness in Vermont and beyond. I'm your host, Irvin Eisenberg, occupational therapist and structural integrator. Resilience Radio is a place for Vermont healthcare providers to talk about the heart of their work and offer resources and inspiration to nurture our resilience both as individuals and a larger community. As always, please realize the opinions expressed by guests on this show do not necessarily reflect my personal opinions or the opinions of Resilience OT. My goal is to showcase the perspectives of a variety of practitioners. Everyone is an individual, and one person's point of view will not resonate with everyone. Additionally, the content on this podcast is not to be used as medical advice or to treat or diagnose any medical condition. Please consult your own healthcare practitioner with any health concerns. Today's guest I've got is Jeremey Lesniak. He's been a martial artist for over 35 years, a personal trainer with CrossFit Level 2 certification, and owner of Whistlekick, a martial arts sparring gear company, and host of Whistlekick Martial Arts Radio, a podcast about traditional martial arts. It's good to have you here today, Jeremey.
Hey, it's great to be here, Irvin.
So I wanted to get started with the listeners getting to know you a little bit better. Could you tell us a little bit about your hobbies and passions?
Yeah. Well, as I jokingly tell people, I work and I work out, and that really does encompass almost the entirety of the things that I'm interested in, whether it's martial arts training or it's, fitness training or hiking. I enjoy being outside. I think the major thing that doesn't fall into that sort of tongue-in-cheek response is gardening. I've got a small bit of land outside of Montpelier and plant a lot of things, a lot of perennials. Last couple of years, I've been doing a lot more with annuals, fruit and whatnot.
I'm sure as a gardener and such, you're more aware of your ergonomics and body mechanics from all of your your other training.
I am. I spend a lot of time squatting. Just like on the ground. Just I don't wear shoes very often, at least when I'm not forced to, and if I'm working in the garden instead of hunched over, I'm usually crouched down.
Yeah, if only more people could and would do that, I think we'd have a lot less back pain and other problems.
I agree.
So could you tell us a little bit more about your background as a movement instructor?
Yeah. So I started martial arts when I was 4, and I started at a time when very few kids were training. I was really lucky. I grew up in this small town in Maine, and this husband and wife had moved to town, and within a year they started teaching karate out of the local community center. And I think I was at the town beach with my mother, which is not a place we went often, so this is really fortuitous. And she met them, and they had put an ad in the paper or something, and she started a conversation and said, "Hey, come meet these people. Do you want to take karate?" And I said, "Sure." I was 4. I didn't know what karate was. This was pre-Karate Kid, or right around the time of Karate Kid, but I hadn't seen it, and I never stopped. So I showed up, I started training, and once I graduated high school, went to college, trained in a number of martial arts there. That's kind of where I started lifting weights, and coming out of college, moved to Vermont, and have always been involved in martial arts and almost continuously involved in some kind of other fitness discipline, lifting weights, etc. And it was through CrossFit, which I found just about 10 years ago, that I learned I enjoyed other movement disciplines. And that became, interest in yoga and gymnastics and parkour, and really just all the different ways that you can move the body.
Well, that's great. I always, as an OT with a focus on resilience, I always like to hear when people have a variety of movement practices, and it really sounds like you've sort of owned that in a lot of ways, your different martial arts and such. And you have a unique cross-discipline approach to movement, it seems here. Could you tell us about what you think is most unique about your approach with all these different things? What's Jeremey movement work look like?
Sure. Well, I'm fond of saying, at least in the context of martial arts, there are only so many ways that you can move the body, and only so many of those make sense through the perspective of combat. All martial arts, regardless of what they are, have some tie, whether it be direct or indirect, to combat, to hand-to-hand fighting. And so within the world of martial arts, which I know you are certainly familiar with, there are there's somewhere between discussion and argument, depending on who you're having a conversation with, about the quote unquote right way to move. But if you look at it, martial arts are far more similar than they are dissimilar. And if you take a step back from martial arts, you'll see that pretty much everything is pretty similar. You take any yoga class, and you could look and see, if I did this position at speed, I could pull some combative aspect out of that. If I take a look at parkour, if I take a look at gymnastics. In fact, there was a really cheesy movie in the mid 80s called Gymkata, and it's all about this guy who learned gymnastics and used it to fight people. And that's the super, super short version of the film. It's all movement. It's all body. And the more diverse you are with movement, the better you are with any goal, whether that's health or longevity or combat or aesthetics.
So when doing movement training, be it things more like CrossFit or yoga or doing more martial arts training, do you see any like major mistakes people do in training that set themselves up for injury that you would caution against, or mindsets that you would caution against?
Yeah, I think every injury or failure that occurs with any movement discipline falls into one or two categories. It's ignorance, which I think honestly is the minority, and the other one is ego. People trying to lift too much or stretch past the point that they should, or, hey, I'm really sore, but I'm going to go work out anyway. Or, I got 2 hours of sleep last night. I'm stressed. I've got a sick family member and I can't focus on what I'm doing, but I'm still going to go and try to put in this really hard workout. And that's where injuries come into play.
So I'm just thinking about some of the people I work with, and motivation being a challenge for some people to get up and do any of these things. And I find myself at times using safety as an excuse not to work out or not to do the movement practices I might do. How do you balance when you're recommending to people, making sure that they're not being lazy, but not sort of ego pushing themselves through when they shouldn't?
And it's an important question, because I draw a pretty thick line between movement and exercise. The two are not the same. And we've sort of blurred that line in modern society. This idea that me going for a walk is exercise, when, to be honest, it's not. What is exercise? Exercise in my book is creating an adaptation in the body. It's something that you're trying to get faster or stronger or jump higher. You're looking for some kind of improvement. Whereas movement is necessary to life. Sit in a chair and don't move, and how long are you going to last? It's not very long. So if we think of it from the perspective of, I'm tired, I'm stressed, I'm hurt, no, maybe I'm not going to go to the gym. Maybe I'm not going to some vinyasa yoga class, but I can still walk. I can still move in some way. And I think that the more we equate movement as a fundamental aspect of health, and I actually prioritize movement over exercise. You exercise can, to a certain degree, replace some movement, but the two are separate enough that without enough movement, exercise is really just trying to hold back the floodwaters.
Mm-hmm. I think about people's sort of daily patterns and what are their meaningful activities, and it's always easier to integrate something, or not easier, but it's always more permanent to integrate something into your life versus have the other chore you have to do. And
I think you've got to enjoy what you're doing. The things that I'm talking about that I do them because I enjoy them. And I'm not someone who stands up on my pulpit, my soapbox, and says, hey, I do these things 7 times a week, each one, and I spend 6 hours a day training and exercising and moving. And if you're not doing that, you're wrong. Because first off, that would be a lie. And secondly, I don't think that that's necessary. Why do we exercise? We should be exercising because it enhances our life. It helps us achieve the goals that we want to achieve. And if the things that you do allow you to do those things for a long period of time, then it's the right amount. We tend to see magazine covers and of course now if anybody's on Instagram, you really can't get away from this. These very fit, very attractive, limited clothing individuals showing us what maybe our physique could be, and a lot of us tend to equate where we should be with that. And if that's what you want to do and where you want to go, by all means do that, but that isn't the only representation of health. There are plenty of representations of health, and I think we all have a pretty good idea whether or not we're embodying that or not.
Yeah, I think of the, I've definitely seen and worked with people who are very fit and healthy in the visual sense, but are have some serious health challenges and psychology around their day-to-day activities. And I've seen other people who, at first glance, oh, that person never exercises and just sort of an obese, unhealthy person. And they're some of the healthier people I know. So I think our benchmark for determining health is very skewed in our culture.
Yes. Yeah. And I think for those of us who are in Vermont or just in general familiar with farmers and farm life, that's a great example of someone that you might look at and say, I don't know that that's the healthiest person. I caught this article. It's really funny that this is coming to mind now. This article yesterday about this really long race in Australia. And I'm trying to remember how long was it? It was typically a 4-day race, 3-4 day race. So hundreds of miles. And these people would train for it all year and they'd show up, 20s, maybe early 30s, and they would run and they had all this gear and training. And one day this farmer shows up in jeans and boots. And everybody's asked, are you sure you're in the right place? And he says, yeah, I want to give this a try. Oh, by the way, the guy's 60. And so the race starts and everybody's really concerned that this guy is going to hurt himself. And everybody takes off past him. But here's the difference. They all rested and slept, and he just went for several days straight. And ultimately, perfect real life. I'm not making this up. This is real. This is a real life Tortoise and the Hare story. And he ends up winning. And he came back and he ran it several more times because he just had this mindset of, I'm just going to go. I'm going to do it. I'm going to plod along. And he had decades of living in that way. You live on a farm, you get up and you're constantly moving throughout the day. No, maybe you're not lifting as much hay over your head as you can, but anybody who's thrown hay for a day knows those bales get heavy.
If you could, if you have easy access to that article or that story, if you could send that to me, I'd love to include that in the show notes if it's
I should be able to find it.
Wow, what a neat story. I often, when I think about farmers and fitness, think about the strongman competitions, and that you've got these people who not necessarily necessary for human health to be able to lift up huge tires and drag tractors and such, but these people who at the first look, they're just obese, unhealthy looking people that can move tractors.
Right. Yeah. If you take a look at powerlifting or strongman or any of these competitions where the focus is not aesthetics, it's performance, and you're not going to see the most aesthetic physiques. And yet on the flip side, you take a look at, bodybuilding and presentations on stage where aesthetics are the priority. And as you said earlier, those are some of, often, not always, but often some of the least healthy people with the most issues around self-esteem and food and just their own place in the world.
Yeah. I want to touch on something that I had heard you say in the past, which is that you want to change the world through martial arts. What does that mean to you?
Yeah. As I've put together this podcast over the last we're coming up on 5.5 years, 500 something episodes, I find myself saying certain things over and over again. And one of the things that I found myself saying is that martial arts is one of the few things that with 6 months of training will change people's lives. I've met a lot of people through my work, through my martial arts, who have said, when I was 9, I got my yellow belt in karate. I trained for like 6 months, and I always remembered that. I've never heard anyone say, I did 6 months of soccer when I was a kid, and I've got these, I learned these great lessons, and I want to make sure that my kid takes soccer because it was so fundamental for me. I don't hear people saying that about other things. Now, are there other things people might say that about? Yes, I'm not saying martial arts is the only thing. But I think when you take a look at what martial arts provides, it's physical awareness. It is directly reflective of your effort in that there are few things where the evaluation, the subjective progress is based entirely on what you put in. Basketball, can you put that ball through the hoop? Soccer, can you help get that ball into the goal? Martial arts, it's not that cut and dry. So that creates a lot of opportunities for people to get better physically, emotionally, mentally. It's overcoming adversity. There are a lot of things. And anybody who's out there who has spent time training in martial arts as an adult or as a kid or has watched their children participate in martial arts knows what I'm talking about. There's nothing else I'm aware of that is more directly supportive in that way based on that output. So imagine then, what would the world look like if everyone had 6 months of martial arts training? I think it would be a much better world.
So what do you think people would have more discipline and self-respect, or?
Yeah, all the above. All the above.
Okay.
I think it's hard to step into martial arts and become a worse person. And yet, take a look at the examples that we see of the best professional athletes, basketball players, football players. They're not all great people. You can become a great pro athlete and not necessarily be a great person. Are there examples of great martial artists who aren't great people? Yeah, but what about most of them? I've been around quite a few top-notch, best of the best in the world martial artists, from a variety of disciplines. And when I compare the quality of their character to the general population, they are better people.
So when you say martial arts, I want to make sure that sort of we're working off the same definition, because I know some people might have sort of the mixed martial arts competitions as people who are, and boxing and some of the more competitive sports. Would you include those as martial arts in your definition?
I'm gonna have a little bit of a cop out of an answer in that everyone defines martial arts differently. My definition of martial arts is it's personal development through the lens of combat, of unarmed or of hand-to-hand combat rather. And so that can include a lot of different things. Boxing can be a traditional martial art. It's a really old martial art, and it can be taught in a way that personal development happens. Does it usually? Probably not. Mixed martial arts. Can it? Yes. Does it? And this is where the focus and the methodology of training becomes important. If you go to a kung fu class, a taekwondo class, a karate class, any class like that that has rank and progression and discipline embedded in the culture, if it and quite often it's compared to this kind of militaristic aspect, and it makes sense because martial arts, we go way back, right, developed out of a need for defense and defense of territory, and there are some militaristic aspects there. But it's that structure itself that creates the space for people to grow and move forward. It's those parameters that facilitate that. And in plenty of combat disciplines, which is the more umbrella term that I use, high school wrestling, for example, an absolutely wonderful pursuit. Wrestlers are some of the best athletes in the world, not just martial artists, but some of the best athletes. But can wrestling be taught in a way that is and is not martial arts? Absolutely.
So it's the personal development piece and the discipline structure that you're using in your definition when you refer to martial arts?
Absolutely. If we go back to, I was talking earlier about basketball, soccer, that objective goal, that determinant. When you step into a typical, let's say, karate dojo, the way the class is structured, the way the people are the reason people are training there, the reason the instructor is there, it is very rarely, in very, very few schools in the world, is the focus of that space on the ability to compete and overcome and be superior to other people. If you join a basketball team, I don't care if it's high school, college, the NBA, or your local rec team, what's the goal? It is to overcome other people and to objectively perform better. And that's the difference.
So I guess what sets martial arts apart from, and I may show my ignorance on martial arts in this question, but practices like Tai Chi, which at least as it's practiced in the US, tends to be less martial and more self-development and movement, and something like Qigong, which I believe is solely a health-based movement practice, but has similar movements in some ways. How do they fit into your definition of martial arts and the benefits that one gets from martial arts?
Well, I take it back to this saying that martial arts gives back exactly and only what you put in. So if you invest a lot of time into Tai Chi, and let's remember, there are a lot of different ways you can do Tai Chi. Tai Chi can be a solo practice that is done purely for health and looks like a really slow, maybe weird, but sometimes really pretty dance. And then you can train Tai Chi for its combative aspects. I know someone in Vermont who is an amazing Tai Chi practitioner and has beat the crud out of me with the biggest smile on his face and in such a way that I have no idea what he did, and I ended up on the ground completely uninjured and laughing. I've experienced this, so I know that there's a spectrum. Tai Chi, Qigong, it all comes from some kind of combative aspect, right? It's personal growth through the lens of hand-to-hand combat. And we all come from the same roots. There's only so many ways the human body can move. So when you look at these different disciplines and talk about, are some going to be better for personal growth than others? I think that's not quite the right question. I look at it as, what are your goals? And I'm one of these rare people, when someone comes to me and says, what martial art should I do? It doesn't matter what martial art I think is best, because what's more important is finding a martial art that they're going to stick with. If somebody shows up to me and they say, I'm looking to do this, and I think, this style of karate would be the best thing for me to do. Okay, is that style of karate even available to you? Is it nearby? Are you going to drive 3 hours to go train in that style? That's not sustainable. So it becomes a process of elimination. What's available to you? Do the times that you would have available to train line up with when classes are? Does the instructor seem like someone that you're going to enjoy spending time with? I think these are far more important questions. I have spent a significant amount of time training in martial arts that I will very quietly and privately admit I don't enjoy, but I enjoy the people, and they have fit into my life in a way that is better than me saying, well, I'm going to go train this martial art over here and never do it.
It's reminding me of talking to someone who has fibromyalgia, who's an older woman who needs motivation to try to do any sort of activity. And I know this person socially, not as a client, and trying to encourage her to walk more. Exercise really helps with fibromyalgia. I understand it hurts. It's good to push through. And she told me, well, the best studies out there show that Tai Chi is the #1 thing, better than any exercise for it. So I just need to get into the right Tai Chi class. I went, well, that might be all well and good, but exercises, doing no activity while you're waiting for the right Tai Chi class to appear in your living room is not going to help you.
Right. The worst Tai Chi class, the wrong Tai Chi class, is still better than none for her. And this is something that I see people doing in not just with respect to martial arts, but with life. We we get so bogged down in the best that we forget that anything is better. How many people say, I'm going to start doing XYZ. I'm going to really, go hard on this diet plan and go to the gym, and I'm going to do this, that, and the other thing, because they're so bent on finding the perfect plan that they forget that slow and steady is a far better way to integrate anything, because habits take time and they take energy. We've got to build something that works in our lives instead of trying to completely bend our life around this other plan. That's not sustainable.
So would you say the structure of the discipline of martial arts tends to lend itself to that?
It can. And again, it comes down to some of the logistical constraints. You and I were both in Central Vermont, and we actually have a surprising amount of martial arts available to us where we are here for the population. There are plenty of places that have far fewer people or far more people that have far fewer options when it comes to martial arts training. But we take a look at, what's going to fit into life. I know people who train once a week. I know people who train less than that. I know people who train every day and they get 3 months in and they get burnt out and they stop training. Is that person going to receive as much benefit as the person who trains once a week for the next 40 years? No.
Sort of trying to bring this back to some of your other movement practices, because I feel like we've discussed heavily about martial arts, and you were early on talking about the fact that any movement practice can be made martial. So if you don't have a martial arts studio or something that's available to you, but you want to make sure you're instilling that quality of discipline and self-development, how do you seek out the right instructor or the right mindset in a non-martial setting that you think would have the benefits of the martial art?
Yeah. Well, I think we can kind of work backwards. If you think about the cliche, the stereotypical martial artist, what would we imagine? We would imagine that they would attend a class, with some kind of routine, whether that's 5 days a week or 1 day a week. We would imagine that they would probably think about it outside of training. Maybe they're interested in their reading books or watching movies. Maybe they're listening to a podcast or two. And they're probably doing some kind of self-practice. We can apply that structure to anything. If you are someone who enjoys, let's say running becomes your outlet. You go running, maybe you have a running coach. You do some drills on your own. Maybe you read a running magazine, listen to a running podcast, and you devote some of your time and your energy to that discipline, and it becomes part of you. It becomes part of your self-expression. And it doesn't matter whether it's running or going to the gym. I mean, honestly, bodybuilders are not people that most of us would ever look at and think have that kind of structure and discipline. But if you live with one, or if you are one, it's absolutely the case. Bodybuilders tend to show up at gyms together. They work out together. Is that a formal class? No, but it's similar in terms of structure. They tend to have workout routines that they're doing on their own. The best ones are doing work on their own as well, and they're stretching and they're doing other things to develop their body. They have routine around nutrition. They're probably listening to podcasts, reading magazines, reading books, participating in online forums. And that same approach to any kind of movement expression can yield maybe not identical, but similar results around personal growth. If anybody's ever been on a diet, whether it's aimed at being temporary or permanent, imagine then what it's like to diet for stage presentation as a physique competitor, as a bodybuilder. That's really, really hard. I mean, these people are measuring down to the gram these things going in their body. That requires a lot of discipline. If you can do that, imagine the other things that you can do with that discipline.
Mm-hmm. So we've talked a little bit about discipline and really honing an art in one particular modality, whatever that may be one particular practice. And then we've also talked about sort of cross training, like CrossFit and doing yoga. And how does someone find the balance between specializing and really developing a discipline and reaching out and having variety in their movement?
And that's a topic that comes up within the martial arts often. It's this spectrum that I identify as diversity versus mastery, right? If I'm going to invest the same amount of time into my movement, if I do one thing, in theory, I'm going to get far better at it than if I apply that same amount of time to different things. And it comes down to, again, what are your goals and what resonates for you? I've seen people who completely fall off the rails when they try to do too many different things versus, say, someone like myself who does not thrive doing the same thing. I mean, you know me a bit personally. You know I have a variety of interests even beyond. We talked about it earlier. I like gardening. I like CrossFit. I like hiking. I like martial arts. I need to mix it up because if I don't, I get bored and my ability to put in that effort actually becomes limited. I need that stimulus because for me, connecting those dots, taking that squatting out into the garden or taking concepts that I've learned from martial arts into, fitness training when I'm working with clients. I mean, I appreciate the intellectual side of combining these things in a way that maybe not everyone does, and that's okay.
That's great. Thank you so much for joining us today, Jeremy. Do you have any parting advice or thoughts for the listeners?
Move. Just move. Find something that you enjoy. And don't judge yourself as to whether it's enough or the right thing or what other people will think. Because any amount that you invest in your body is better than none.
Any amount you invest in your body is better than none. I really like some of the themes Jeremy touched on in this interview. We discussed representations of health and what it means to have a healthy body. We talked about the difference between exercise and movement. Jeremy explains that movement is what we should be doing regularly, and exercise is what we do when we want to develop a new ability or skill. We also discuss that the goal of exercise should be to improve your life, and how the best exercises and movements are the ones that you enjoy doing and will do. If you like this podcast, please subscribe via your podcast program of your choice. I'd appreciate it if you would also leave a review and share the podcast with a friend you think would enjoy it too. I hope this episode was useful to you. Thank you for listening to Resilience Radio.